So hello and welcome everybody to this edition of our channel, which we're calling 6 Feet Under, powered by Lees and Associates, cemetery planners and designers. And today I'm delighted to be joined by our founding principal, Erik Lees. Welcome, Erik. And what we'd like to do is talk a little bit about this question, why we in the cemetery business. That's something which councillors, senior leadership across Canada are beginning to ask. It's been there for a while. So I'm wondering, Erik, whether you could kick us off and share your thoughts as to why that question is being asked right now.
Yeah, well, not just across Canada, right, Richard? Across North America and even other places in the world where we work. Oftentimes, whether it's investors or elected officials, ask that question, which is always important. What is the purpose of what we're doing here, and why is it so important? We can go in several directions with this. Your first question, why is it important? Is that where you want to start?
Let's start with that one, yeah, and then we can unpack this, because there's people listening to this will no doubt probably chime with comments. Hopefully we'll hear from some folks, but let's go with that one.
Well, I think in order to frame it, we should say that we're talking here about public sector organizations. So there are very good business reasons, commercial reasons to look at either entering into or sustaining cemetery services. But let's assume for the moment that we're talking about public sector agencies, organizations, departments within local government, usually local government, although of course, there are some state and provincial governments that have cemeteries too. So let's assume local government. And I think one of the answers to this question, why is it important for local government to be providing these services, is that we are here to serve families from the prenatal stage all the way through to the end of life stage. Whether that's ensuring mums and dads have the kind of health information, the social information they need to bring a child into this world through daycare, through education, through physical fitness and physical literacy, through literacy, all the way through life to the end stages where death does come to all of us, along with taxes, especially in the public sector. And so if you're looking at cradle to grave services, cemetery services are the obvious punctuation mark. They're also, so just philosophically, if that's council's approach, then surely there's a place for cemetery services within the suite of municipal services that are offered. Not only that, as an important point number one, but cemetery services are key to the physical and mental, emotional health of our citizens. It's not just about interring the corporal body. It is about taking care of those of us that are mourning, and there will be many, many more as the baby boomers' demise comes upon us. So we need to, and we'll talk, there's lots of room to talk more about that aspect of it. But the third, I think, is an important societal aspect too. If you think about where in our society physically is the narrative of the community told any better than in a cemetery? For every citizen that's ever lived, worked, or led the community, surely each of us deserves at least a generation of memorialization, and the stories that make up our lives. That is community, is it not?
I think that. Do you think things are getting a little lost as cemetery operators who, often municipal cemeteries were started when the municipality itself was incorporated, was set up maybe 100 years ago or more. And to your first points about the value of the cemetery service, do you think that it was much clearer back then when there was land available? There was perhaps more reverence to the teachings of the church, other things which meant that the honoring and burying our kin, our families, was much more ingrained in just the way we did it. We did things. And I'm wondering whether that now is just being clouded a little bit as society is changing, as we're becoming more secular, or whether there are just so many more competing factors right now, which making those in leadership with responsible positions and limited resources look at this again. I wonder what you think has there been a shift with that original philosophy about providing these cemetery services to community members?
Well, I think there has been a shift. First of all, some municipalities, the cemetery existed long before the municipality formally did. Here in Vancouver, for example, the people were being buried not far from where I sit now at Mountain View Cemetery before the city was incorporated. And in those years, and we're talking sort of late Victorian, but still closer to the Victorian era than this era. Death was very much more a part of everyday life, and we've managed to kind of shelve it largely, which I think we'll get to this in a moment, how we've managed to sort of sideline all things death, including cemeteries. But back in those years, it was just a given that local government, or as you inferred, a church group, a fraternal organization, would take responsibility for burying our dead. There weren't conversations like this about should you be, or could we be, or do we have to be in the cemetery services business. It's, of course we are. We are an emerging modern society. This is how we deal with one another in death. As William Gladstone, a prime minister from your old cohort, was fond of saying, is show me a cemetery and I'll show you with empirical evidence how a society cares for one another. And I think that people 100 or 200 years ago certainly appreciated that. And if you think about it, this is one aspect that makes us unique as humans, is we do care for our dead, and have from time immemorial. Regardless of your ethnic heritage, there's places of burial are considered sacred places, and the act is considered sacred. So, back to the question of, is it important? Yes, it's not only important; it's a sacred act.
So, what do you think is the disconnect between some people, senior leadership, councillors, some, not all by a long shot, asking the question, why are we in the cemetery business? What's the disconnect, do you think? Because I sense the danger potentially of into families, into community without them. You talked about the mental health piece. You also see adverts for, listen, give us a call, we'll take care of the cremation. It's done in 24 hours. You don't have to be bothered with any of this. And then you'll have families left with some cremator remains, and they have no idea what to do with those. Sometimes those things hang around people's houses and there's 6 or 7 cremator remains from various family members. What is maybe I'm leading off into answering the question myself, but I'm curious as to what your thoughts are about the dangers with the idea of not providing a cemetery service to families, and what's the cost to everybody for not doing that?
Well, yeah, I think disconnect is a good word, and there are a number of dangers. First of all, why is a disconnect happening in today's modern local government management? I think it does have a lot to do. Just societally, we're not comfortable with death, and so many counselors, and you and I have both seen this, get squeamish about it, and don't want to talk about it at all. So that's part of the disconnect. The other part of the disconnect, and you inferred it as well, Richard, is that it's even those within the bereavement sector tend to use the word industry and the death care industry. And language like that has commercialized our sense of understanding, interpretation of how we care for our dead. And so when a counselor or a mayor is faced with his department head saying, Mr. or Mrs. Mayor, we really should have a plan for our cemetery, one of the first thoughts is, well, wait a minute, isn't the cemetery industry taking care of that? Isn't ABZ Corporation down the street taking care of that? Why do we have to do that? Much more difficult question to answer when you're in the service versus starting the service, although there's, believe it or not, folks, there's lots of new cemeteries being built out there. But in the context of how cemetery services and all the services related to the death of people has been commodified, and the general trend in local government for everything to be considered within business terms. I mean, you and I, Richard, we even call them business plans, normally referring more to the dollars and cents side of things. But even our language is the language of retail and commodity versus the language of embarking upon the sacred act of burying our dead. And so I think that's where the disconnect. Those are some of the reasons why the disconnect happens. And why is it not healthy? Well, first of all, if you're in the business, there I go. If you are providing the services, very difficult to stop providing them. And I think we're going to talk about that in a moment. But also very difficult to say to family members, no, we're not going to we're not going to provide the services, or we're not going to provide them for free anymore. And so it's politically, statutorily difficult.
What do you think the costs are then if municipalities, churches, whoever decide that at some point, say for example, there's a turning point in the life of a cemetery, we're running out of land. That's a common theme for many cemeteries. What is the downsides to simply ceasing the cemetery service like altogether, like all cemetery services? Like we need to get out of it. Well, what are the impacts down the road to the costs borne by a municipality, the costs borne by families? What do you think that the real downsides are to ceasing a cemetery service? And then we can talk about how difficult it is to actually stop that.
Well, I think some of the real downsides I've referred to. This is a sacred act that we are the stewards of in local government. Not providing cemetery services and burying our dead in a respectful, meaningful fashion, not just as an industrial act, but in a meaningful way where we care for the families and we care for the dead, is part of what modern society and complete community should and do embark upon. And so societally important. Also, there are contractual arrangements almost always, if not just morally, then contractually. So if I buried my spouse in a cemetery 15 years ago, and she or he is laid to rest there, then the reasonable expectation that I have is that I'll be able to be buried there next to him or her as well. If not next to her, then it's certainly in the same property. And oftentimes I have a contract in place where I, on a pre-need basis, have purchased land. And so the municipality is obliged to honor that contract for me to be buried there, or whoever I choose to be buried there. And that contract can persist for many, many years, oftentimes, a generation or more. So if a municipal council made the decision today to cease cemetery services, sorry, but that's not possible until the last contract is fulfilled, which could be many, many years down the way. And in the meantime, the services the actual opening and closing of the grave still has to occur for all those like me that have a contract in place, and the maintenance of a site has to be maintained at a respectful standard and level, and for some time even after I've died, at least 10 years, if not another generation, while those that mourn my loss, or those that have been buried long after the cemetery, in a word, closed per se, has occurred. So it's not simply a matter of closing the door and saying, oh, it's not like saying, okay, we're not going to provide swimming lessons anymore, boom, swimming lessons close, or we're not going to provide daycare anymore, boom, or we're not going to supply water to this neighborhood anymore. We'll just turn off. It's not like that. Not that you would necessarily do that. You do any one of those things, but oftentimes managers incorporate within their thinking of cemetery services, they treat them like any other piece of municipal infrastructure, and it's not the way it is.
So in terms of, those barriers to exiting the cemetery business from any entity that's got one, is there also this gap in thinking, well, there hasn't really been a depth of thinking as to, well, who picked this up, because of all the reasons that you just explained. Very rarely, I don't think I've ever come across in my career, a municipal cemetery that's actually gone through this process to find a private partner, or even hand it over wholesale, because there are costs and management involved in that relationship as well. Have you seen that example, or have you seen municipalities start to look at that, but then for all sorts of reasons decide that it just is not going to work to move the cemetery service over to a private entity or a public-private partnership?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have. I've seen the process, and I've also seen where private cemeteries fail, usually through incompetence or malfeasance, and the province inherits them, and guess who the province turns those cemeteries over to? The municipality. This has happened in the prairie provinces a number of times, unfortunately. Other municipalities, including Vancouver, which closed its doors to sales, not activity, because as I said before, the activity of contracts that need to be fulfilled still has to carry on. But the sale of new contracts ended in 1987, when the managers at the time said, well, the cemetery's full. We've done various infills. We can't do any more. We're going to sell it. Well, by the late 90s rolled around, with the advent of cremation and rather aggressive private sector entities in the industry approaching the city saying, hey, we can run that cemetery for you. We'll assume all your contracts, and you won't have to be in the business anymore. Well, there was an outcry in the community, and it wasn't long before a local government said, no, I don't think we want to do this. And instead, they put efforts into determining what a vision for the cemetery could be. A business plan was created. And as you well know, our firm's been working there for the last 25 years, fulfilling the vision that the community decided they wanted. And as you also know, the private industry went through a real downturn, turn of 2000, 2005, in that period where they had overcapitalized. And it's a darn good thing that Vancouver didn't jump into bed with a local cemetery provider. In other communities here in British Columbia, the call has gone out for partnerships for new cemeteries, and there has been some interest by the private sector, especially when the focus has been on cremated remains. The real challenge is the lack of suitable land for traditional full death burial, but that's the subject of another podcast.
Erik, what do you think the opportunities are if really it's a bit of a dark alley to follow down, looking at the barriers to exiting the cemetery business? What do you see as the opportunities for, let's just talk about municipal cemeteries in Canada at this stage?
Well, I think there's two that come to mind. One is treating cemeteries like memorial parks rather than simply places to bury our dead. An important aspect for sure to bury our dead in a respectful way. But if you look at cemeteries as places of the community narrative, places of contemplation, of memory, of loss, of meaning in different ways. Look at cemeteries as arboreta, one of the few places within a city where trees can grow to full maturity. Look at cemeteries as places of biodiversity. Now that property, which heretofore had only been considered for one single purpose, is now meeting multiple purposes and bringing much more of a full value equation to government and to the community. The value proposition changes quite radically, doesn't it? So there's just, and that's just a flip of a philosophic mind switch, really, isn't it? So easy to do. And our firm and previous publications have talked a lot about how we can reimagine cemeteries. And the other, and it's perfectly legitimate to think about municipal infrastructure trying to recover some, if not all, of its costs. And for many municipalities, there just hasn't been given due consideration for that to happen. And especially when you compare the cost of private sector cemetery services against local municipal sector cemetery services, there's usually a gap there. And if there is, then why not close it? Because it is incumbent upon elected officials and senior management to ensure that the best value is being served to the community and that the tax base is being managed in a responsible way. So having a revenue stream, identifying what that is, and bringing in fair pricing is something that many municipalities are still far behind on.
You talked about value and you talked about design in there. We've talked about the value of good design, the value of placemaking, the value of making cemetery spaces or memorial parklands, as we just conceived it, have relevance. How do you see design playing a role to shift the needle in terms of increasing revenues and reducing, councillors' legitimate concerns about tax dollar support?
Well, first of all, I think it's not just about the dollar value. It's about creating meaningful places of memory and burial that the people can have an emotional connection to. So it's just the right way to do it. Gone are the days when headstones were cracked over and laid flat just so that we could mow over top of them. The tyranny of maintenance, as I call it, and we're still, unfortunately living with some of those decisions from the 60s and 70s where that occurred. So that's one reason to treat these places more respectfully, and how you treat them more respectfully. But good design pays in the end. In those communities where there are choices between a commercial or industrial cemetery and a municipal cemetery, in many ways, design can set the standard for meaningful places of burial and memory. Unlike in the private sector, which is driven by shareholder profits, the local government has the latitude to, especially when it comes to the creation of cremated remains interment options, really be very creative, be innovative. And as I said a moment ago, create places that serve more than just the mechanical service of interment. They become places of contemplation as well, and all those other things, all those other values that I mentioned. And so they become an integral part of the parks and open space system in the community at a time when most parks and open space systems are under siege for a variety of reasons.
Eric, were there any other things in this, this broad conversation about why municipalities are in the business of cemeteries? Anything else that we should touch on before we just wrap this conversation up? It's sort of endless, actually, but we'll have to draw a line underneath it for now and come back. But is there anything else which you think is important to just talk to our viewers and listeners about?
I think this has been a good introduction into why cemeteries are important in our society and why it's important for local governments to take a proactive hand in their management, design, and planning.
Okay, all right. Well, everybody, listen, thanks for joining us. And we're going to wrap it up right now. We hope it's useful. Do get in contact if you like with either me or Eric. You can find us at our website, and we'll look forward to talking to you further in the future. Thanks, everybody.